The morning my mother told the hospital staff I wasn't family, I was standing 6 feet away holding my father's medical chart. I had driven through the night to get there. 11 hours from Portland to Boise, coffee going cold in the cup holder, my hazard lights blinking through a stretch of Idaho highway where the fog sat so low you couldn't tell where the road ended and the sky began. My phone had buzzed at 2:41 a.m. It was my brother. Not "come quick" or "dad's bad." Just, he had another episode. Mom's handling it. Mom's handling it. That was the first lie. The second one came at 6:17 a.m. in the ICU waiting room when my mother looked at the intake nurse and said without flinching, "It's just the two of us. His daughter lives out of state. We haven't been in contact." I was wearing yesterday's clothes. My hair was still damp from the gas station bathroom, where I'd splashed water on my face somewhere outside Twin Falls. I said, "I'm right here." My mother turned slowly like she was surprised to find me inconvenient. "Oh," she said, "you came. Not thank God, not I'm so glad. Just you came, like I'd shown up uninvited to a dinner party she'd already plated without a chair for me. My name is Wren Calloway. I'm 31 years old. I'm a licensed respiratory therapist at OHSU, which means I spend my days keeping people's lungs working when their bodies have decided to give up. I know what a ventilator sounds like at 3 a.m. I know which numbers on a monitor matter and which ones are noise. I know how to read the face of a doctor who's already decided something but hasn't said it yet. I knew all of that when I walked into my father's room and looked at the chart they'd handed me. And I knew, standing there, that none of it would matter to my family. To them, I was still the daughter who left, the one who chose a career over proximity, the one who didn't come home for Christmas 2 years ago because I was covering a colleague's shift in the PICU. The one my mother had quietly, carefully been rewriting out of the family story for years, until I was barely a footnote. I should start at the beginning, or at least the version of the beginning I can actually prove. My father, I'll call him Dad because that's what he was, whatever else he became, grew up working class in Nampa, Idaho. He built a small commercial real estate business from nothing, the kind of quiet success that shows up in a paid-off house and a truck that's 10 years old but runs clean. He was not a warm man. He showed love the way his own father had shown it, by showing up, by fixing things, by not leaving. He coached my soccer team for 3 years and never once told me I played well, but he drove 40 minutes each way to every game without complaint. My mother is a different kind of person entirely. She came from a family that cared enormously about appearances and very little about what sat underneath them. She married my father because he was stable and because stability, to her, was the highest form of attractiveness. She gave him 2 children, my brother Garrett, who is 4 years older than me and has spent his adult life becoming the son she wanted, and me. I was not what she wanted. I asked too many questions at the dinner table. I argued with teachers. I chose biology over pre-law. I moved to Portland at 22 for a respiratory therapy program and never moved back. And she took that personally in a way she never said out loud, but made felt in every holiday phone call, every comparison to Garrett's wife, every cheerful mention of how close Garrett lived, how present he was, how thoughtful. Garrett is thoughtful the way a politician is thoughtful. He knows exactly what to say and when to say it, and he says it in a way that always benefits Garrett. The night I arrived at St. Luke's, Garrett was there too, though I hadn't known he was coming. He was in a button-down shirt at 7 in the morning, which meant he'd slept nearby, which meant he'd known longer than he told me. He hugged me at the door like we were close. He smelled like hotel shampoo. "Good you made it," he said. I spent that first day running interference between the attending physician and my mother, who had a habit of saying, "But he's always been so strong," in response to medical information she didn't want to accept. Dad had a cardiac arrhythmia that had gone unmanaged for too long, and now there was fluid around the lungs and a question about the kidney numbers that nobody had a good answer for yet. I translated. I asked the right questions. I stayed in the room when the hospitalist came by at 6 p.m. and again at 9, and I made sure someone wrote down what she said. My mother went to dinner with Garrett at 7. She didn't ask if I wanted to come. I ate vending machine crackers in the waiting room and called my supervisor to extend my leave. The next 3 weeks went like that. I was there before visiting hours started. I tracked his inputs and outputs, flagged a medication interaction that the floor nurse caught and corrected, slept 4 hours a night on a pull-out chair in his room when they finally let me stay. My mother came in the mornings dressed like she was going to church, sat in the corner chair and talked about the neighbors. Garrett came every third day and asked the doctors the same questions I'd already asked, then texted my mother their answers like he'd discovered something. Dad got better slowly. When he was alert enough to talk, he said very little. He'd never been a talker. But once, late at night, when the floor was quiet and I was charting his O2 sat in a notebook I kept, he looked at me and said, "You didn't have to do this." I said, "I know." He looked at the ceiling. "Your mother thinks." He stopped, started again. "I never told you enough. I didn't push." He wasn't a man who finished sentences like that, and I'd learned a long time ago not to force them, but I held on to it. I carried it out of that hospital room like something breakable. He was discharged after 22 days. My mother hired a home health aide, a woman named Bet, efficient and kind, and told me they had it handled. The way she said it made clear that handled did not include me. I drove back to Portland. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I've seen the way these stories get told, and the truth is messier than the clean version. I went back to my life. I worked my shifts. I texted my father every Sunday, short messages about nothing, and sometimes he replied and sometimes he didn't. I did not confront my mother. I did not demand a seat at the table. I had been trained, from a very young age, to accept the space I was given. That training is expensive. It costs you things you don't know you're spending until the bill comes. The bill came on a Tuesday in October, 14 months after the hospital. My father's attorney called me directly, a man named Aldous Price, who had a voice like old wood and didn't waste words. He told me my father had passed at 4 a.m. that morning. Cardiac event, in his sleep. Bet had found him. No one from my family had called me. I found out from the attorney. I drove back to Boise in a fog that had nothing to do with weather. When I arrived at the house, Garrett's car was in the driveway, and there were 2 women I didn't recognize going through boxes in the garage. My mother met me at the front door. She looked tired in a way that made her look older, and for a second I thought maybe things would be different. Maybe grief would be the thing that cracked us open and let something real through. She said, "I assumed you'd send flowers." I stood on the porch where I'd grown up, with my dead father inside the house, and I thought, this is it. This is exactly who we are. I went in anyway. The memorial was 4 days later. My mother had planned everything, which was her right, and she'd planned it the way she planned everything, beautifully, efficiently, and in a way that reflected well on the family. There was a photo display in the church lobby. Garrett and his wife were in 7 photos. My father's colleagues were in 3. I was in 1, a group shot from a family reunion 12 years ago, half obscured by my uncle's shoulder. I stood in front of that display for a long time. A woman came and stood beside me. I didn't know her, and then I did. Dr. Helen Marsh, not from the list, a new name entirely. No, I need a different name. Her name was Dr. Cecilia Odom. She'd worked with my father years ago on a commercial development project, back when he was still actively managing properties. She had silver-streaked hair and the kind of posture that suggested she'd been told her whole life to stand straight and had actually listened. She said, "You're Wren." I said I was. She said, "Your father talked about you constantly, every single time I saw him." I didn't know what to do with that. I said, "Thank you." She squeezed my arm and walked away, and I stood there feeling like I'd been handed something in a language I'd forgotten how to read. The will was read 2 weeks later at the office of Price and Associates downtown. My mother sat on one side in charcoal gray. Garrett sat beside her in a suit that still had the dry cleaning crease in it. I sat across from them in my only blazer, which I'd bought for a job interview 3 years ago. My father's estate wasn't enormous, but it wasn't small either. The house paid off, worth about $480,000 in the current Boise markets, a rental property in Meridian that had been cash flowing for years, retirement accounts, life insurance. Aldous Price read through it methodically. To my mother, the primary residence and its contents, the savings accounts, the life insurance payout. To Garrett, the Meridian rental property, free and clear. To me, a separate account I hadn't known existed, held in a trust established 8 years ago, valued at just over $190,000, with a condition attached that I use it within 5 years toward a medical degree or advanced clinical certification, as directed by my father's letter of intent. There was a letter. Aldous produced it from a folder like it was ordinary. 4 paragraphs, tight, signed in my father's handwriting. I recognized the way he wrote his name. The same signature I'd seen on permission slips and birthday cards. The looping R that always looked like it was trying to escape the rest of the letters. The letter said he'd watched what I did in that hospital. He said he hadn't understood before then how much I knew. He said he was sorry it took him so long to see me clearly. He said he'd set up the trust 6 years before the hospitalization because of a conversation we'd had when I was 24 that I barely remembered. A night I'd called home frustrated after a hard shift, and he'd listened in silence for 20 minutes and then said, "You should go back to school. You're too good at this to stay where you are." I'd thought he was dismissing me. He'd been paying attention. The room was very quiet when Aldous finished reading. My mother looked at me. Her expression was the one she used when someone at a dinner party said something she found in poor taste. Then she looked at Price and said, "I wasn't aware of that account." Garrett said, "Is that even legal? He didn't discuss this with anyone." Price said it was entirely legal, established in accordance with Idaho trust law, and that the intent had been clear and properly documented. What came next didn't surprise me, but it still landed like a fist. 3 days after the reading, Garrett called me. He used his careful voice, the one that meant he'd rehearsed. He said the family felt the will was an anomaly, that Dad hadn't been well in his final years, that there was a question about his capacity when the trust was established. I said, "The trust was established 6 years ago, Garrett." He was 62 and playing pickleball twice a week. Garrett said he was just sharing what the family was feeling. I said, "You mean what Mom is feeling?" He paused. "She's grieving. I'm grieving too." Another pause. Then, quieter, "It would make things easier if you just declined it, Wren. Donated it back to the estate. It would keep things from getting complicated." I hung up. The call from my mother's attorney came the following Monday. A letter. Certified mail. Formal language. The kind of sentences that cost $300 an hour to construct. The grounds. Undue influence. The claim that I had used my position as an informal caregiver to manipulate my father's financial decisions, that my presence during his hospitalization had been opportunistic, that the trust was evidence of a compromised relationship between a sick man and a daughter who had inserted herself into his care. I sat with that letter for 2 days. I reread it several times, trying to find the version of myself it described. I couldn't find her. On the 3rd day, I called Aldous Price. He had already anticipated this. He told me, in his unhurried way, that my father had left additional documentation, records of communications, notes he dictated to Price over the years, a list of dates and reasons. My father, it turned out, had been preparing for exactly this. He knew his family. He built the trust like a man who expected the walls to need reinforcing. But there was still the matter of the claim. There was still the court date. I went back to Portland for 3 weeks and worked my shifts and didn't tell most people what was happening. A colleague named Fiona, who had worked beside me for 4 years and knew me the way you know someone you've stood beside in a crisis, noticed something was wrong. She didn't ask. She just started leaving coffee on my station in the mornings. That's the kind of care I'd been waiting my whole life to get from my family and never quite did. The kind that shows up without needing to be invited. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my apartment looking at the ceiling, and I thought about the drives to Boise. I thought about the cracker wrappers in the hospital waiting room. I thought about the sound of the ventilator cycling in my father's room at 2 in the morning, and the way I'd learned to read his breathing from across the room, and how I'd known before the monitors told me when something shifted. I thought about what my mother had said at the hospital the first day. His daughter lives out of state. We haven't been in contact. Like I was already a past tense. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting with one bulb slightly off its rhythm, the faint smell of old coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. My attorney, a woman named Greta Sundquist, who was approximately 5'2" and had the energy of someone who found litigation genuinely enjoyable, had told me to dress professionally but not formally. I wore my grey slacks and a blue blouse, and I carried a folder I didn't need just to have something to hold. My mother wore black. Garrett sat beside her in another press suit. They looked like a family portrait. They looked like the photograph in the church lobby, complete, composed, not a space between them where I might have stood. My mother's attorney was a man named Sterling. No, I won't use that name. His name was Douglas Fenn. He was smooth in the way that expensive things are smooth, no visible edges, everything buffed. He presented the family's case with the calm of someone who had done this many times, a daughter who had been largely absent, who had reappeared during a medical crisis, who had positioned herself as a caregiver, who had then benefited financially from that positioning. He showed a text message I'd sent Garrett 6 months after the hospitalization. Has anyone talked to Dad about the follow-up cardiology appointment? I keep asking and no one answers me. He presented it as evidence of my attempting to insert myself into my father's care over the family's objection. I had sent that text because no one was scheduling the appointment. My father's cardiologist later confirmed he had missed 2 follow-ups before I started calling directly. Greta presented that confirmation. She also presented the hospitalist notes from his admission, which documented that I had correctly identified the medication interaction. She presented my personnel file, not to show off, but to establish that I understood what I was looking at when I read his chart. She presented the 6 years of trust account statements, showing the account's establishment date and the consistent contributions over time. Then she asked Aldous Price to read the relevant section of my father's letter of intent into the record. She did not ask me for anything. She was not angling. She sat beside his bed for 22 days and asked for nothing, and that is how I know she came, because she loved me and not for any other reason. I have not been a demonstrative father. I am aware of this. I am trying, in the only way I know, to correct that now. My mother looked at the table when he read it. Garrett looked at his hands. The courtroom was quiet in a way that felt almost careful, like everyone in it understood they were inside something that mattered. Douglas Fenn attempted to argue that the letter itself was evidence of my father's impaired state, that a man of sound mind would have discussed this with his family. Greta pointed out that the account had been established years before any decline, that my father had met with Price annually to confirm his intentions, and that sound mind was not a standard that required consultation with one's adult children before making financial decisions. The judge was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses she kept taking on and off. She had the particular quality of someone who had heard a very large number of people attempt to sound reasonable while doing unreasonable things and was not going to be fooled by it today. She ruled in my favor. Not dramatically, not with a speech. She simply stated her findings, noted that the claim of undue influence was unsupported by evidence and contradicted by documentation, confirmed the validity of the trust, and moved on to the next item on her docket. I sat for a moment after it was over, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wasn't. I had expected to feel something enormous. Instead, I felt quiet. The way you feel after a long shift when a patient finally stabilizes, not celebratory, just still. The work is done. The person is breathing. That's enough. Greta shook my hand. Aldous, who had stayed for the proceedings, nodded at me in his unhurried way. My mother walked past me without stopping. Garrett lingered near the door and, for just a second, I thought he might say something real. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then he straightened his jacket and followed her out. I stood in the parking lot for a long time. The Boise sky in November is a particular shade of gray, flat and low. The kind that makes everything look temporary. I thought about calling someone, and then I thought about who I would call, and I realized the list was short, but it was mine. Fiona, my supervisor, a friend from grad school who'd moved to Seattle and still remembered my birthday without Facebook telling her to. Short lists are honest lists. I drove to my father's house. My mother wasn't there. She was staying with a friend while things settled. I let myself in with a key I'd never returned. The house smelled like cedar, and a little like the hospital, which was probably just my memory doing what memory does. I walked through the room slowly, the kitchen where I'd learned to make his coffee, the back porch where he'd taught me to change a tire on a Saturday afternoon when I was 16, not because it was a skill a girl should have, he said, but because it was a skill a person should have. The study with the bookshelves he'd built himself, unevenly, the second shelf always slightly bowed. I found a box on his desk. My name was on it in his handwriting. Just Wren. No note, no explanation. Inside, a first-place ribbon from a science fair in 7th grade that I didn't know he'd kept, a photocopy of my respiratory therapy license, a newspaper clipping from the Portland Tribune about a hospital initiative I'd been part of 3 years ago, a small article about pediatric respiratory outcomes, my name in the 4th paragraph. He'd circled it with a pen. He'd been reading about me. He'd been keeping track. There's a version of grief that feels like finding a letter you can never answer. That's what standing in that study felt like. Not relief exactly, not closure. Something more complicated, the knowledge that you were seen, even imperfectly, even quietly, even too late. I took the box with me. I left the house keys on the kitchen counter. In the months that followed, I enrolled in a nurse practitioner program at OHSU, which is what my father's letter had gestured toward, and what, if I'm honest, I'd wanted to do for years but kept deferring because deferring was easier than deciding. The trust covered the first 2 years without blinking. I kept working my shifts. I got used to being exhausted in 2 different directions at once, which is a skill that also turns out to be transferable. My mother did not contact me. This hurt less than I expected, and more than I admitted. Garrett sent a text in February. It said, "Hope you're doing okay." That was all. I stared at it for a long time, turning it over, trying to find what he meant by it. I decided he meant exactly what it said, no more and no less. I wrote back, "I am," and left it there. The woman from the memorial, Dr. Cetalia Odom, reached out through LinkedIn 2 months after the hearing. She said she'd heard how things had unfolded, and she wanted to say something. She said my father had shown her my license when I got it, back when she and he were still meeting quarterly for coffee. He'd kept a copy in his wallet, she said, until the wallet got too full. I didn't know what to do with that either except carry it. There's a group I found, an online community for estranged adult children, which sounds grim and is sometimes grim, but is mostly just a room full of people who understand a very specific kind of loneliness. We talk on Wednesday evenings. Half of them are in situations far harder than mine. A woman named Adeza had been cut out of her family's business after building it for a decade. A man named Gil had driven cross-country for a parent who never said thank you. What we have in common is not the circumstances but the sensation, the feeling of having extended yourself fully toward people who were looking the other way. What I've learned from them is that the story doesn't always resolve, the villain doesn't always apologize, the family doesn't always come around. Sometimes you win in a courtroom and lose everything else, and you have to build something new out of what's left. And that building is quiet and unglamorous and takes longer than anyone wants it to take. I planted an olive tree in a pot on my apartment balcony in March. I don't know why an olive tree specifically, except that they're supposed to be hard to kill, and I liked the idea of something that could take drought and still produce something. It's leafing out now. My father's study is still bowed on the second shelf. I know because I went back in the spring to pick up a few things. Practical things. A lamp I'd always liked, some books. And I stood in front of that shelf for a minute, touching the slight downward curve of it, the way it dips in the middle from years of weight. He built it himself. Unevenly. It held anyway. Some days that's enough to mean something, and some days it isn't, and I've made peace with not knowing in advance which kind of day it will be. What I know is that I showed up. I kept showing up, even when no one gave me a reason to, and eventually the reason became that it was who I was, not who they needed me to be. My name is Wren Calloway. I am a respiratory therapist and a nurse practitioner student and a person who drives 11 hours in the dark for someone she loves, even when love is not what she gets back. That's enough of a story to stand on.